All right, so last week we talked about cellular respiration, and that was the process that cells undergo to harvest energy. Okay, they're breaking down carbohydrate, usually glucose, to produce ATP. Okay, but we need to talk about how that carbohydrate, how that glucose is made in the first place, and that is made through photosynthesis. Okay, so let's take a step back. Let's talk about autotrophs and heterotrophs. Okay, autotrophs are producers. They produce their own food. They make food using energy from the environment and carbon from inorganic molecules. So they take energy that they get from the environment, harness that energy to make their food. Okay, where do they get the carbon in order to make their food? They get carbon from inorganic molecules. Okay, as opposed to autotrophs, you have organisms that are heterotrophs. Humans are heterotrophs. We can't make our own food. We have to consume it. So heterotrophs are consumers. They obtain carbon from organic compounds assembled by other organisms. Now you have different types of autotrophs. You can have chemoautotrophs. Okay, chemoautotrophs, they use inorganic substances as their energy source. Okay, a lot of times you will see chemoautotrophs in areas that the sun or light from the sun doesn't reach, because the other type of autotrophs are photoautotrophs. Okay, and photoautotrophs use sunlight as their energy source. So unlike light, chemical energy can power the reactions of life and can be stored for use at a later time. Okay, so that's why um, not everyone can use energy from the sun to power themselves. Okay, so chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates that we use, that our cells use, that other cells use. Okay, chemical energy can also power, can power the reactions of life, unlike light, and that chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates and other molecules can be stored for use at a later time. So here's the overall reaction of photosynthesis. Okay, now if you took this arrow and reversed it, you would basically have the reaction of cellular respiration. Okay, but in photosynthesis, water is needed, carbon dioxide. All right, and if we're talking about photoautotrophs, energy from the sun to come together to produce the food in the form of a sugar. Here's glucose, and then a byproduct is oxygen. All right, so photosynthesis can be broken down into two basic processes. And the first stage of photosynthesis is called the light-dependent reactions. It's the first stage of photosynthesis, is that photo part, because it's driven by light energy. Okay, so chemoautotrophs don't undergo photosynthesis because they're not getting energy from the sun. Only photoautotrophs will undergo photosynthesis. Okay, and so they're going to use energy from the sun to drive this first series of reactions, the light-dependent reactions. And in the light-dependent reactions, you have the conversion of light energy to the chemical bond energy of ATP. There's our good buddy ATP again. Okay, in addition to this, you have the splitting of water, okay, called by photolysis, because the energy from the sun is used to split that water. And so when you have the water split, you have hydrogen ions and electrons, which are then accepted, okay, by this NADP molecule to become NADPH. So the two major products of light-dependent reactions is ATP and NADPH. They are needed for the second stage. But as a byproduct, you have oxygen that is released because you have the splitting of water. Okay, then you go into the second stage of photosynthesis, the light-independent reactions. And this is the synthesis part of photosynthesis because you have the making of the food molecule. Okay, so NADPH and ATP that are generated by the light-dependent reactions drive the synthesis of sugars from carbon dioxide and H2O. Okay, and then once the NADPH and ATP are used up in the light-independent reactions, NADP and ADP are then recycled into the light-dependent reactions to be converted back in NADPH, ATP, so they can come back into the light-independent reactions. Okay, so here's this broken down graphically. Okay, so in the light-dependent reactions, you have ATP, NADPH, and a byproduct of oxygen. All right, and then in the light-independent reactions, you have ATP and NADPH along with carbon dioxide coming in to produce the sugars. Okay, and then NADP, ADP are then recycled back to the light-dependent reactions to be converted back into ATP and NADPH. Okay, now remember from the cell lecture, where does photosynthesis occur? It occurs within the chloroplast. Okay, so both the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions are occurring within the chloroplast. Okay, and the chloroplast has different parts to it. You have the thylakoid membrane. All right, basically the thylakoid membrane looks like a stack of pancakes within the chloroplast. They're highly folded into stacks of interconnected thylakoids, and this is where the light-dependent reactions are. Okay, where the photosynthetic pigments are stored. And then the area around the thylakoid membrane, you have this fluid called the stroma. Okay, this is cytoplasm-like fluid inside the chloroplast, and this is where the light-independent reactions occur. So you need to know where the light-dependent reactions occur and where the light-independent reactions occur within the chloroplast. Okay, there you go. So you have the chloroplasts have an outer membrane, inner membrane, just like the mitochondria, remember? And then you have the thylakoid membranes made up of individual thylakoids, and then the fluid that's flowing between the thylakoid membranes, the stroma. All right, and again, so the light-dependent reactions occur within the thylakoid membranes. The light-independent reactions, or the Calvin cycle, occur in the stroma. But before we get more into photosynthesis, we need to kind of take a step back and talk about light. So light is electromagnetic radiation. All right, now we don't necessarily think of light being matter, but it is. It travels in waves. All right, in energy particles called photons. Okay, and light is measured, or the unit of measurement for light is wavelength. Okay, all right, and that's the distance between the crests of two successive waves. All right, and so the photon's energy is related to the wavelength. The shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy that the light is carrying. All right, so if you think about you're at the beach, you're standing in the water, and waves are hitting you. Okay, now at first those waves are hitting you, every few, after several seconds. Okay, all right. you get hit by a wave. 10 seconds later, you get hit by another one. 10 seconds later, you get hit by another one. Okay, you wouldn't think that that's necessarily carrying a lot of energy. But if you're sitting in that same water, you get hit by a wave. 2 seconds, wave. 2 seconds, wave. 2 seconds, wave. All right, it's a shorter wavelength. Okay, and you're going to feel that higher energy from that shorter wavelength. All right, now, so the electromagnetic spectrum, okay, a portion of that is the visible light. And that visible light drives the photosynthesis. It's the main form of energy that drives photosynthesis, and it's a small part of the spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. All right, so 380 to 750 nanometers wavelength. All right, and we perceive within that portion of visible light, we perceive different wavelengths of different colors. That's why the rainbows have different colors. All right, because each of those light that makes up the rainbow is at different wavelengths. All right, and now light with all the wavelengths with all the different colors together appears white. But you can separate that white light by prisms. Okay, so here's the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, the further you go to the left, the shorter the wavelength, but the higher the energy. That's why X-ray, gamma rays, ultraviolet radiation, these can do damage to your body cells because they're packing a lot of energy that can damage your DNA. All right, and then you have your visible part of the spectrum, and then as you go this way, longer wavelengths, less energy. So photosynthetic organisms use photosynthetic pigments to capture light of specific wavelengths. Okay, so plants, they have pigments, chemicals that they produce that will capture that light energy of specific wavelengths. All right, and these pigments are different colors. Okay, and one of the most common photosynthetic pigment is chlorophyll A. It absorbs violet, red, and orange light, but it reflects green light, and so that's why it appears green to us. Okay, in addition to chlorophyll A, there's chlorophyll B, and there's also accessory pigments. Now they will capture light of other wavelengths so that they appear different colors. Okay, and so they may not necessarily have a big role in photosynthesis, but they also serve other functions. Such as there's a pigment that appears red. Okay, so that pigment is used by some plants to attract pollinators. And the combination of photosynthetic pigments differs among species because species are adapted to the environment in which they evolved. And light is not universally or uniformly spread across the Earth's surface. Different light hits different parts of the Earth. Okay, and so plants that are adapted to different areas are adapted to the type of light which they are regularly exposed to. Okay, so think about green plants, they appear green because of an abundance of chlorophyll A. Okay, now when a lot of green plants that we're used to will lose their leaves, okay, in the fall. And before then, they may change colors. Those leaves may change color. All right, and what's going on when they change colors? It's because the plant is breaking down that chlorophyll so those chemicals can be stored later to make more chlorophyll. But as it breaks down that chlorophyll, those other accessory pigments become visible now. So here shows a graph showing you some different photosynthetic pigments. You have chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and accessory pigments called carotenoids. All right, and as you can see that they absorb energy at different spots. So why would a plant want to make or use energy to make these different types of photosynthetic pigments? Don't you think it would be more efficient to make the same type of photosynthetic pigment? Probably, but they take the energy to make these different photosynthetic pigments because that allows them to capture light across a greater part of the spectrum. So they can capture more light with these different photosynthetic pigments, and that light can drive photosynthesis. All right, so if we when we talk about the light dependent reactions, okay, this is the first part of photosynthesis. All right, that's driven by energy from the sun. All right, we see a collection of photosystems. All right, so what are these photosystems? Photosystems are a large complex of molecules within the thylakoid membrane. All right, and each photosystem has a reaction center. Okay, that is surrounded by a ring of light harvesting complexes. So you have things surrounding that reaction center that is capturing energy from the sun, those photons, and then that spurs a cascade of reactions within this photosystem. All right, so you have light harvesting complex in the thylakoid membrane. So what you see is it absorbs a photon. All right, and so within that harvesting complex, they have electrons. Well, once they absorb a photon, they are absorbing energy. And then that energy is then transferred to one of its electrons, which jumps to a higher energy level. And then that electron gets sort of passed around by other complexes until it reaches the reaction center. Okay, so here you have a photon, hits a light harvesting complex, an electron is excited, and then that electron gets sort of passed around until it reaches the reaction center and a primary electron acceptor. Okay, and if we look at the light independent reactions, we have two types of pathways that involve these photosystems that we just talked about. We have this non-cyclic pathway, which uses photosystems 1 and 2. Okay, non-cyclic pathways, you get ATP, you get oxygen, you get NADPH, and this is the primary photosynthetic system. Okay, all right, so most photosynthetic organisms usually use the non-cyclic pathway, but sometimes they convert to a cyclic pathway. Okay, and in the cyclic pathway, only photosystem 1 is used, not photosystem 2. Okay, and so because of that, you're only producing ATP. And we'll talk about why organism that's undergoing non-cyclic pathway will then convert to cyclic pathway. All right, so let's go through the steps of the non-cyclic pathway. So the first part of the non-cyclic pathway is photosystem 2. So photosystem 2 absorbs a photon. Okay, well then it's going to donate electron to the reaction center. Okay, all right. That photosystem 2 will lose an electron to a series of sets, which we'll talk about. So it's missing an electron. Well, where does it regain that lost electron? It regains it by splitting a water molecule. Okay, and when that water molecule is split, you get hydrogen ions. And again, just like in cellular respiration, when we think of hydrogen ions, you should also think of an electron. Okay, all right, so when water is split, you get hydrogen ions and electrons, and then you get oxygen as a byproduct. All right, so those electrons that are excited by the photons, they enter an electron transfer chain in the thylakoid membrane. And again, this electron transfer chain we talked about in cellular respiration in the mitochondria. So it's the same basic principle in photosynthesis. All right, because as we saw in cellular respiration, a hydrogen ion gradient, okay, across that inner mitochondrial membrane. We also see a hydrogen gradient here, but it's across the thylakoid membrane. Okay, after the electrons move through the first electron transport chain, they are accepted by photosystem 1. Okay, all right, and then they enter a second electron transfer chain. And then at the end of that transfer chain in photosystem 1, you have NADP accepting those electrons, gaining a hydrogen ion to form NADPH. Okay, so we would say the NADP molecule is reduced, remember, because the molecule is reduced when it accepts an electron. All right, so NADP accepts an electron, accepts a hydrogen ion, and you get NADPH, and that is needed for the light-independent reactions. So we talked about the formation of NADPH, but we haven't talked about the other major product of light-dependent reaction, and that's ATP. Okay? All right, and if you also remember that we talked, electron transfer chains are involved in the photosystems, creating a gradient of hydrogen ions being moved against their concentration gradient. How are they being moved against their concentration gradient? Do you remember? Is from the energy from the electrons being released as they go down the transfer chain. All right? And just like in cellular respiration, the only way those hydrogen ions can move down their concentration gradient is through ATP synthase, which uses that energy as hydrogens move down their concentration gradient to form ATP. Okay? So you have electron transfer phosphorylation just like you had in cellular respiration. It's just in a different organelle and different molecules are involved, but the principles are the same. So now you have both major products of light-dependent reactions. You have ATP and you have NADPH. Okay? All right, so here are the electron transfer chains, and every time an electron is transferred one molecule to another, energy is released to bring hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient. And the only way for that hydrogen ions to go down their concentration gradient is through ATP synthase, which uses that energy to make ATP. Okay? All right, and then the final electron acceptor at the end of photosystem 1 is NADP, which then forms NADPH. And NADPH, ATP are needed for the next step, the light-independent reactions. Okay? All right, same sort of figure here, just looks a little different. So the summary of non-cyclic electron flow occurs in thylakoid membranes. Photons from the sun provide the initial energy. Oxygen is a major byproduct from the splitting of water, all right, so that the electrons can be replenished within the photosystem 2. ATP is made through electron transport chain that connects photosystem 2 and 1, and then NADP accepts electrons from photosystem 1 to become NADPH. All right, so we'll stop there and pick this up on the next part.